Welcome to this final review video for America's Biblical Heritage. It's that time of the year. It is finals time, and we're excited about this finals test on Thursday. We're going to get this video uploaded right away so you have plenty of time to review for it. I'm going to start the video by going over what the final exam looks like so you have a very good idea of the kinds of questions that you will see. The very first page and a half deals with people and quotes. So if you can imagine all the different quotes I gave you and quotes that we covered on some quizzes, quotes that we covered I would mention from time to time. There's a page and a half of people and their quotes. The next section is a multiple choice section, and it deals with a lot of the questions we've asked. I have tried throughout the whole semester to ask questions over and over and over and over again. So hopefully this will help you. The next section is a matching the different colonies with a description or something involving that colony. Now I will say we had a quiz that dealt with that, and I remember it was one of our quizzes we generally didn't do so well on. So I would suggest for sure studying that section. The next section is another multiple choice section. There are a few short answer questions, and then there is an entire page of different documents matched with the description of them. They might be documents or books, or different acts maybe. All right, and so that is that. Then there's a page of true and false questions. I have italicized the part that is either true or false, and so you don't have to question about what we're looking for. Then there's a matching section, matching the founding father with something about them. And of course, we had a quiz that dealt with a lot of these. I've added a few things onto there, and so that'll help you. And there's actually 2 pages of that. So I said a page, there's 2 pages of that. There's a total of 115 questions. So a lot of questions on there. We also got a bonus question. So it is possible for you to get 101% on this test if you get it completely perfect. All right, now for the review. I will do my very best to try to cover all the information on here. Once again, hopefully you took good notes. You will want to look over your notes as well, just in case I missed something. I'm not promising that I've got every question on here, but I will try my very best. We mentioned the court case, Church of the Holy Trinity versus the U.S., and it was Justice Brewer in that case, which said, this is a Christian nation. We mentioned that case was a very important case. It was the decision was only 16 pages long, but it provided 80 different historical precedents that basically proved that we had a Christian nation. We mentioned as well another Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who made this quote, "Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?" And that was Justice Joseph Story. We mentioned Woodrow Wilson made the statement, America was born a Christian nation. America was born to exemplify that devotion to the elements of righteousness which are derived and revealed from the Holy Scripture. We mentioned President Jimmy Carter said, we have a responsibility to try to shape government so that it does exemplify the will of God. Then we mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville, who said, there is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. We talked about what changed some of that thinking. We mentioned 1962, the court implemented an agenda of public secularism, and in 1962 banned prayer in the public schools. The following year, in 1963, of course, they banned Bible reading in schools. And then in 1980, they banned the 10 Commandments from public schools. And so those different dates we've mentioned over and over. We talked about the colonial era. We talked about different things that went on in the founding of America. We mentioned, of course, Leif Erikson, the Viking explorer, who was the first European to discover North America. Of course, Christopher Columbus is considered the discoverer of America. Leif Erikson, though, the first European to discover North America. We mentioned early people that were here before Europeans, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans. We mentioned the fact that they all practiced human sacrifice. We mentioned the different European powers that came and colonized the New World. Of course, the Spanish, who came mainly to search for gold. We mentioned France, whose interest dealt with fur trading. And then we mentioned England. Not to say that they didn't want gold or any of that as well, but they came mainly for religious, economic, and political freedom. We mentioned that it was England in which God allowed to really become the dominant European power in the New World eventually. We mentioned the fact that England was a Protestant nation, not a Catholic nation. England also had the Bible available, which made it very special. We mentioned the fact that there were a couple of different groups that were working in England at the time. We talked about the Puritan group that sought to purify the Anglican Church from within. Not the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. Of course, Anglican Church being the Church of England. We also mentioned the Separatists, and they sought to separate from the Anglican Church because they felt they were too Catholic. And of course, the Pilgrims would be a good example of the Separatists. We mentioned early English colonies, Jamestown, Virginia, being the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Several things about Jamestown, and once again, we mentioned that there is a matching section matching these different things, so you might really pay attention here. We didn't do so well in this quiz. Jamestown followed the common store economic system, a form of socialism. Of course, they had that period of time where they almost starved to death. Then Captain John Smith took charge and established a principle: if anyone would not work, they wouldn't eat. Of course, really saved them. We mentioned that Jamestown is where the idea of slavery started in British North America. 1619, a Dutch ship arrived with 20 African slaves, sold them there to Jamestown, Virginia. We mentioned as well that Jamestown was a colony full of men and boys. There were no women in Jamestown, not till much later. And Jamestown is the colony that went through the time called the Starving Time, in which they nearly died. They did all sorts of stuff, including eating dead bodies, which was pretty gross. We mentioned the Plymouth colony, Plymouth, Massachusetts. That was founded in 1620. This was the colony founded by the Pilgrims. We mentioned the fact that the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower boat, 102 settlers. Of course, we mentioned some of the leaders there, William Brewster being the pastor of that flock. We mentioned as well William Bradford was their second governor, as well as the first historian, father of American history. He wrote Of Plymouth Plantation, America's first history book. We mentioned before the Pilgrims got off the Mayflower. They did sign the Mayflower Compact, the first governing document written in the New World. We mentioned as well that there were some Indians that helped the Pilgrims. Samoset was the first Indian that greeted them in English. Of course, God ordained that he would meet them. He introduced them to Squanto, who later became their guide, interpreter, and teacher. We mentioned the miracle, the fact that the Pilgrims landed in a piece of property that was empty because that Indian tribe, the Paluxet Indian tribe, had been wiped out by a disease the year before, which caused them to not have any kind of resistance when they landed. We mentioned as well that the Pilgrims passed what was known as the Law of the Pilgrims. It was the first comprehensive body of law to be enacted in North America. The next colony we mentioned was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, established in 1630. This was the colony founded by Puritans. Over 1,000 Puritans moved from England really for religious freedom and started the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We mentioned they had a famous governor, John Winthrop, governor of the colony, and he described the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a city upon a hill. He said this: "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon the hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us." Of course, we mentioned the fact that it was from this colony that the idea of the Puritan work ethic came. That is, that work is a gift from God and a means of glorifying Him. We mentioned that there were plenty of wonderful things that the Massachusetts Bay Colony gave us. We did mention the fact that they did not believe in separation of church and state. They were a congregationalist run colony and did not give freedom of worship to other groups. They were also the colony that exiled Roger Williams, and so there were some things there that dealt with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Then we mentioned Providence Colony, or the Rhode Island Colony. This was the colony founded by Roger Williams, and of course we mentioned just previously that Roger Williams was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We mentioned the fact that it was the Rhode Island Colony, or the Providence Colony, which was the first colony to establish complete freedom of religion and separation of church and state as well. Rhode Island Colony became a safe haven for Baptists. Of course, Roger Williams, as well as John Clark, helped to establish this colony and give it its religious freedom. Then we mentioned the colony of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker. This was the Quaker colony. Pennsylvania also established religious freedom, not as complete as the Rhode Island colony did, but basically religious freedom. We mentioned, of course, a famous quote by William Penn, who said, "I know some say, let us have good laws, and no matter the men that execute them, but let them consider that though good laws do well, good men do better." And of course, we mentioned William Penn being a great founder there. Of course, had the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Then we mentioned the Georgia colony, founded by James Oglethorpe, and it was the last of the 13 original colonies. It was founded as a debtors colony, really. It was meant for debtors to be able to go and pay off their debts so they get out of debtors prison. It didn't really work out the way they thought it would, but nonetheless, we see some famous people that were a part of that colony. We mentioned John and Charles Wesley, as well as George Whitefield. They served as chaplains of the colony. Whitefield had several orphanages as well in Georgia. And of course, we mentioned Whitefield's friendship with founding father Ben Franklin. And Franklin actually gave a lot of money to Whitefield's orphanages. We mentioned the different religions in the colonies at the time. Of course, we mentioned Maryland being the only Catholic colony, Rhode Island being a colony that all religions were legal, of course, but it was mainly a Baptist colony. Pennsylvania, a Quaker colony. A lot of the other colonies were Anglican and or Congregationalists. We mentioned that during later, about 100 years after the settling of America, we mentioned the fact that there was quite a spiritual decline. Of course, in the days of Whitefield, there was the Great Awakening, but that revival was preceded by a serious decline spiritually. And part of that decline was a result of what was known as the Halfway Covenant, which allowed people to be church members who weren't even saved. If your parents were a church member, then you were too. And of course, it took a Great Awakening to kind of shake churches out of that. Some of the preachers of the Great Awakening: Jonathan Edwards, who preached really America's most famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Jonathan Edwards, also known as the foremost theologian and one of the greatest intellects that America's ever produced. Then we mentioned George Whitefield, once again, friends of Ben Franklin, and known as the most powerful voice of the Great Awakening. We talked about colonial life in America. We talked about education. It was Noah Webster who said, "Education without the Bible is useless." And of course, early colleges were Bible colleges. Harvard University was the first institution of higher learning in British North America. We mentioned the fact that his first president was Henry Dunster, who later became a Baptist. And of course, when he became a Baptist, he got kicked out of being the president of Harvard. But nonetheless, Harvard University, President Henry Dunster. We also mentioned the fact that even early on, before America became actually America, there was a lot of religion in education. We mentioned the Old Deluder Satan Act of Massachusetts Bay Colony, which basically established public schools in the colonies. And the reason for those public schools, so that they could establish the reading of the Bible. A very important thing. We mentioned the New England Primer, the most widely used textbook in colonial America, Noah Webster's Blueback Speller, as well as the McGuffey Readers, which were some of the very first reading books in the colonies. We mentioned some different documents, of course. One of the very famous documents we mentioned was the New England Confederation, which purpose it was. It united 4 colonies together, and their stated purpose was to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ, as well as to give each other mutual protection. We mentioned the fact that although the federal constitution doesn't mention a lot about God, we mentioned the fact that state constitutions have a lot to say about God, and almost every state constitution mentions him. We mentioned the French Revolution contrasted with the American Revolution. We talked about the fact that in the French Revolution, they tried to get rid of God. They tried to get rid of Christianity. They declared reason their religion. They renamed the Notre Dame church as the Temple of Reason. And yet in our revolution, we wanted God in our country. We wanted Christianity. We mentioned different books and people that helped kind of set the stage for our new country. Of course, we mentioned the Geneva Bible, translated in 1560. It was the Bible of the Pilgrims. It was also the first study Bible, and had study notes, which was against the divine right of kings, which didn't make the kings very happy, especially King James. Of course, King James authorized the King James Bible in 1611, the most beautiful and elegant translation of the Bible in the English language. We also mentioned the commentaries on the laws of England, written by William Blackstone in 1765. Blackstone is the one who stated that it's the law of nature is not reason, kind of like John Locke said, but it's the will of God. It kind of brought God into that idea. We mentioned Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith. We mentioned that established the idea of a free market economy. Of course, in the nations of England at the time, mercantilism was the big economic system. Mercantilism, which says a nation is wealthy based on its gold. But we mentioned, of course, Adam Smith wrote about free enterprise and free market. We mentioned as well 2 treaties of government written by John Locke. We mentioned that John Locke is the one that gave the idea of the social contract theory of government, stating that government gets its authority from the consent of the governed. Then we talked about the idea of a laissez-faire economic system, the idea of hands-off policy. We talked about in the early, really just right before the War for Independence, we mentioned some of the things that led up to the War of Independence. Of course, we mentioned the Boston Massacre, where some of the colonists were killed by British soldiers. We mentioned the fact that it was John Adams that agreed to defend the soldiers in court. Even though he didn't like what they did, he chose to defend them. We mentioned as well Samuel Adams, who helped form the Committee of Correspondence. These were committees that tried to keep people informed about what England was doing to our country. We mentioned that Parliament allowed the British East Indian Company to ship tea directly to the colonies, being able to basically undercut all the competition. And of course, that caused a lot of things, including the Boston Tea Party. We mentioned that they passed a series of acts called the Intolerable Acts, which really was designed to punish the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the Boston Tea Party, and it was not very well liked. During the First Continental Congress, we mentioned a document called the Declaration of Resolves, which resolved that the British Constitution granted the American colonists the same rights as English citizens who lived in England. And of course, they published that Declaration of Resolves. Later on, as we were leading up to declaring independence, it is the famous founding father Patrick Henry who made that statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." And of course, that was just before really calling for a separation from England. We mentioned the shot heard around the world was fired at Lexington and Concord. And of course, that was really kind of what set off the war. Before we went to war, though, Congress did approve something called the Olive Branch Petition, which really sought for trying to make peace, kind of a last-ditch effort to make peace before war happened. As a response to that, Parliament passed what was known as the Prohibitory Act, which basically barred all trade with the colonies, removed them from the protection of the king. During that time, another document was written, a pamphlet called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, which really called for the immediate separation of Britain. Separation began early for the Rhode Island colony, May 4th, 1776, 2 months before the whole country declared independence. The little Baptist colony of Rhode Island declared their independence. Of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, and that document basically stated our reasoning for leaving England. By the way, it was the Declaration that was signed on July 4th, not the Constitution. We mentioned as well some of the great battles that took place during the War for Independence. We mentioned the Battle of Yorktown, which was kind of the final battle that gave America independence. Then we mentioned the Treaty of Paris, which was signed, that ended the war. During that time, of course, we had some great leaders, some great founding fathers. George Washington, of course, being the greatest of our founding fathers. He's known as the father of our nation. Started out early as a commander of the Virginia Regiment. Of course, we mentioned the fact that later he became the commander-in-chief of our Revolutionary Army. In both of those capacities, he pushed for the need of military chaplains. Of course, his favorite chaplain was the Baptist chaplain, John Gano. George Washington often used that phrase, the smiles of heaven. He said the blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially in times of public distress and danger. We mentioned that Washington is the one that gave us really our first Thanksgiving, although it wasn't declared a federal holiday until Abraham Lincoln. He's the one that declared the very first Thanksgiving. We also mentioned the fact that Washington seemed to distrust Quakers during the War for Independence, mainly because they refused to fight. We mentioned that he supported the idea of paid missionary efforts to the Indians, that the government actually pay missionaries to go convert the Indians. We mentioned the fact that George Washington chaired the Constitutional Convention. What a great guy. He made this statement: the smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. And of course, that little quote, smiles of heaven, always was a favorite phrase of Washington. We mentioned a document that was signed under the Washington administration, the Northwest Ordinance. Of course, that ordinance was also signed under the Articles of Confederation, but re-signed under the Constitution. That granted religious liberty in the Northwest Territories, but it also prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territories, which was a very large area of our country. We mentioned several of the founding fathers. Of course, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison on the subject of slavery. They called slaves men. and so they were anti-slavery, although some of them did own slaves. We mentioned Thomas Jefferson as well, an anti-slavery president, although he also owned slaves. We mentioned part of his thinking was the quote that he said that slavery was like having a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. We mentioned the fact that Thomas Jefferson was very concerned about the possibility of a slave insurrection, or the idea that if slaves were released quickly, that they might actually rebel and try to overthrow the country. And so there was a lot of concern there about that slavery issue. Of course, we mentioned the fact that we did have what was known as the importation clause. The founding fathers passed that, which abolished the idea of slave trade, as in bringing in slaves from outside the country. We also mentioned, of course, they passed the Northwest Ordinance, which outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territories. We talked about another founding father, Ben Franklin. Of course, we mentioned Franklin, known as the Newton of his age. Very amazing founding father. Of course, he was the author of the Poor Richard's Almanac, which really was second only to the Bible in popularity as far as different books that were written. We mentioned the fact that he was a great inventor. He invented several things. Of course, he had his electricity experiments. He invented the lightning rod, bifocals, and several other things. He was also the nation's first postmaster, proposed a daylight savings time, was a co-founder of the very first volunteer fire department, established the first library. So he did a lot of firsts. He's also known as the father of the Confederation. He was the oldest member of the Continental Congress, and also was the only founding father to sign 4 of the major documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Alliance with France. And so had several different documents there. We mentioned, of course, that Franklin wasn't a strong Christian like many of the other founding fathers were, although he wasn't a deist as well. He was very good friends with George Whitefield, as we mentioned, but there is no definite conversion there for Ben Franklin. We mentioned James Madison. Of course, he is known as the father of the Constitution. He did the most work on the Constitution. We mentioned the fact that he went to what later became known as Princeton University. He was trained as a minister, but took to politics instead. Madison was heavily influenced by an experience he had with his father, standing outside the jail cell, listening to Baptist preachers preach from their jail cell. That instilled in him the idea that there ought to be religious freedom. We mentioned that he came under the influence of Reverend Witherspoon, and that influenced a lot of his views on law and government. We mentioned the fact that he is also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, along with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. He is the author of the Bill of Rights. He was also Secretary of State under President Jefferson, and he later became the president, the only president in U.S. history to actually physically lead soldiers as president on the battlefield, and that happened in the War of 1812. He also outlived all the other signers of the Constitution. We mentioned the fact that he pushed the idea of consent of the governed, natural rights of the citizens. He was also anti-slavery and really pushed for freed slaves to be able to go to Liberia and start a free country there. We mentioned the fact that he was very much for freedom of religion. He penned the famous Memorial and Remonstrance, in which he opposed Patrick Henry's tax provided to push up certain state churches. He believed that every church ought to have freedom to worship. Then we talked about Thomas Jefferson, really our last of the major founding fathers that we talked about. Of course, we talked about he was from Virginia. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. And we mentioned that He became the second vice president, third president, first secretary of state. He was also a minister to France during the Constitutional Convention. We talked about the fact that he wasn't a signer in the Constitution, and that might have been a good thing because Jefferson had a lot of really religious views that were kind of different than some of the other founding fathers. We mentioned that he was the one that coined the phrase separation between church and state, and we mentioned that most everybody took that to mean exactly what Jefferson meant by it, and that is that government should stay out of churches. However, it was in the Supreme Court, Everson versus Board of Education, which 1947, that really changed that wording to make it seem like that church ought to stay out of government. We mentioned that it was Jefferson that had much tragedy in his life. His wife of 10 years died. He also buried 5 children before five out of his 6 children before he died. And so we mentioned the fact that that seemed to skew a lot of his beliefs. I believe that concludes our review video. I think that is a very good review there. Once again, 115 questions. I'm not sure how many things I went over, but I think that's most of it. So study your notes, listen to this video several times, and we'll be praying that you do well on Thursday.